Hi, welcome to Planning and Adapting Through AI Transition and Evolution. I'm just delighted you can join us today because this is such an important topic. And with that, I am Cynthia Chang Correa. Some of you already know me. I do see that we have on this session some folks who may not. And so I'm just popping my bio up here. I'm not going to go into detail, but to say that I'm coming at this topic from from a multidisciplinary standpoint, which I think is an important aspect to underscore. Because this is really an intersection of multiple disciplines. What we're talking about here in terms of AI across everything, and so I come at this initially from sort of my early days, information science and knowledge management. I built competitive intelligence on top of that with early warning and foresight work. And along the way, a number of other aspects that I think are very important, and they're in my bio as well. So I hope that that will also be the theme to take through this too, is that we're all going to have to be cross-functional specialists in some ways. And I'm also coming at this too from a process perspective. So a lot of my work has been in process consulting, helping organizations and teams with their intelligence and early warning processes. And that I think is very important in the way that we approach how we solve these AI questions. And so for this, are the questions that we're going to be tackling are basically, where to start. That's sort of a big question that folks tend to have nowadays is, I just don't even know where to begin. And to be able to gain clarity through that, and to be able then set up yourselves to prepare. And with this, I want to just underscore, because this touches on so many different disciplines, that the importance of this session is that we're really focused on research analysis, insights, knowledge work for this series to help those of us who are in knowledge and insights work to be able to adapt through this, because, well, projections are, we're all going to get hit pretty hard. And so it's really important that we stay proactive in our adaptation. Also, we're going to be operational and tactical in today's session. As we talk about planning and roadmaps, there are strategic aspects to that, but I'm not going to lean into that. And we can certainly talk about those things in other sessions because we're using these webinars and building on them to explore a number of different facets. But today we're really just trying to get at, well, what can we do with teams? And so with that, a little context is in order. And some of you who are with us in January's first Friday, in which we looked at where we've been in 2023, as well as where we're headed in 2024. You saw this slide. And most people who are steeped in AI believe that we are really in this time of exponential growth in terms of what AI is going to be able to do in terms of capability and an impact, and a whole host of other things surrounding it. So it really will touch, if it hasn't already, and accelerate nearly everything that we do. And it's important too for us to understand that first movers, and many of us are first movers as we're adapting this earlier on, we're going to be moving by fits and starts. And there are real advantages to this, but it also means that there will be a little bit of a learning curve, and there will be some hiccups. But it's very important that we adapt as we go. Another thing that I want to highlight too from our last session is just to underscore the volume and pace of how all of this is moving. And in this case, I popped up an image of the generative AI video timeline that you see in front of you. And you can see here how, compared to Q1, Q2, and Q3, generative AI video exploded in Q4. And that's one of the trends that we talked about in January. And so that's just one facet, one tiny little thread that will eventually have a big impact. And so that's just representative of what we're up against. So as we're exploring these questions and looking around us and trying to understand how this is going to impact us, the big question, for us is how do we start? And so we're going to be focusing on assessment and planning, some approaches and tools that can be useful to you, that you can apply for yourselves and your teams. So first and foremost, those of you who have been with me on these journeys of over the past few years, you've heard me just talk about, it's just so important to understand your environment and the environment in which you're operating, where it's headed. So situational awareness is in order. Understanding the AI landscape. And I know that's a tall order. We're all trying to do that right now, but I'll have some suggestions for you there too. But we also want to know where you are. And in terms of understanding how you relate to that landscape. And so there are certain tools that we can use. And it's very important that we break this down along a number of different levels. So here you see that, for AI, as it hits organizations, teams, and practitioners, I've just broken this down into a number of practical dimensions: capabilities and maturity, competencies, and skills. And this is really more practical, in terms of what we can do and then in the tools we can apply. And you'll see here that with organizations and teams, there are tools that we can apply for towards maturity. With teams, it's that plus competencies. With practitioners, we're more focused on growth. It's competencies plus skills, and you'll be seeing that in some of the tools that we'll be sharing. And then the third step is just then determine where you're headed. Once you understand the landscape, once you know where you are in relation to these dimensions, you have a much clearer picture about where you can go. And that's where it's really specific to where you and your organizational goals are. And so, so that's something that you'll have to have discussions about with your various stakeholders and your team members. And so let's take a quick look at the AI landscape. Now, some of you are also familiar with this too, because if you've been following me, this has probably been burned into your retina, because I use this to really underscore just where we've been and where we're going. And so here, it's just the current landscape. In other presentations, I talk about where we were in 2018, what this landscape looked like. Now, what you're looking at here is we broke down this landscape or organized it according to point, application, and system level AI. And I've talked about this before in past videos, so I won't go into this right now, but I'm also happy to to fill you in if you're new to this. And certainly I can we can talk about this too during our discussion. But the point here is that the landscape is vast, but it's organizable. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to organize it so we can understand it. And you can see here that it's even organized according to various types of tools and in these various categories, from various facets of generative artificial intelligence, to very practical tools, application tools that are here. And so understand your landscape. And once we do, we can understand how it fits into the work that we do. So this is where I take the intelligence, the competitive intelligence function, and those of you who are not in CI, forgive me, as I dive into the CI a little bit here in terms of the process, but I feel that this is an easy process to use. It's a convenient one because it's very nicely laid out. You've got the intelligence functions laid out here. Most of us understand various types of planning, needs definition planning, published research, human research, analysis, and then reporting out and so forth. And then also the team and programmatic management applications too. So, but we have, by the way, so we have worked with folks in R&D, strategy, information centers that use different processes and workflows, and this works too. And so we're just leaning into CI as an example, but so please don't feel that this blue column needs to have the dimensions here. You can replace it with whatever it is that you're looking at, because R&D groups would look at this somewhat differently as well, and so you would plug this in. And so then I've broken this out, into generative AI models, various types of sort of developer build outs, plugins, APIs, and then the specific types of GPTs, because we know ChatGPT now has their own Play Store and people are building out specific GPTs. We've got commercial tools as well that are focused more on AI support, and then we also have low code, no code solutions and integrations. And integrations are basically tools that allow you to kind of chain or put together multiple forms of AI tools. And so within each category, I broke this down, right? Generative AI has commercial and open source types. And then under each category, you've got large language models, small language models, large multimodal models, and that's reflected here under open source. Because again, back in the day, in November of 2022, it wasn't so segmented, but we're starting to break out into these segmentations. And so this model needs to reflect that. So this really does have to be a living tool as we continue to sprint or react to the sprinting that's occurring around us. And then with the commercial, you've got commercial tools that are broken down into task-oriented tools, process-oriented tools, and system-oriented tools, very similar to the point application and system organization of that landscape that we just looked at. And then with low code, no code, we've got specialized tools, and then we've got more generalized tools. And then with integrations, you've got DIY, which are some of the off-the-shelf types of tools and services. LangChain, Zapier, are some examples of tools that allow you to, to integrate. And then you've got custom ones where you're hiring out to an IBM to help you build out, and so, or Palantir or whatnot. And so here, what you're seeing is we've got this broken out where it reads like a heat map. So with say, for example, published sources or open source intelligence, we see that there are tools that exist, and that's in the highlighted, the brighter green. These tools, there are tools that exist that can help us with these functions. And I don't get granular here because it'll just get messy, but you can certainly break this down. And for those of you who've been with me through my training with SLA and various other places, ACI and other, that we use the source map, and so that gets granular, and so this can get very granular as well along those lines. But the idea here is that you want to map this, the various types of developments and capabilities in this landscape to your work to see what is available and what you can leverage. And granularity is key when you start to, this is just high level, but granularity is key when you start to decide on which types of tools you actually want to adopt, because you have to scrutinize those tools, not just for alignment for your purposes, but we know that these tools, some of them are not quite ready for prime time, or that it's just very early days and we have to be very vigilant. There is not a single tool right now that I would just let loose and simply rely on without any amount of scrutiny. And this can also help you understand that too. So here we've got the ones that are lit up, and then I made some notes too. So for example, with analysis, I made notes that these are just very early days, very, very simple analytical tools, more so than even published sources. And so and then we also see here that some of these have borders around them, and that just means that it's emergent. And I want to have emergent tools on my radar as well to see whether or not they will make it, towards, these, sort of filled in cells, so that I will know if I can begin to start thinking about them more seriously. So each one of these categories have their, own mix. And you can see here with the developer tools that these are mostly quantitative analysis, not qualitative analysis. And so even with generative AI, and so and then with humans source collection, so these are the interviews that we conduct. It's really mostly transcriptions, summaries, and then you also have at the system level some assistants and co-pilots that are putting in play in various enterprises. And these will allow you to harness internal human sources much more efficiently. So that's how we would use this tool to be able to help us understand the landscape to what we do within our own teams and in our own organizations. And so to help you with the landscape as well, there are a number of different tools, services that are actually comparing these various tools and services. And so here we have Sapling's the LLM and Index. So this is strictly focused on large language models, and they have the leaderboards. It's a very long page. I've just created a snapshot of their comparisons. This page. So basically, this is just a sort of an index where you can just a table where you can just click on whichever large language model tool you want to look at and see how they pit against each other. So this is, just comparing side by side. And then this is open source large language model comparisons as well, for those of you who have DIY in-house capabilities to build those out. So So the landscape is changing. There are a number of different types of landscape tools, and it's important to just start harnessing what we know about it, into what you're doing. And so now we want to know where we are in terms of capabilities and maturity. And so with that, let's start with the maturity model. Some of you are already in organizations, especially larger enterprises, in which you've been talking about AI maturity using various forms of AI maturity models that are out there. There are those that IBM has one, Microsoft, MITRE. There are just many out there, and so. So what we've done is we've actually created our own, just because we needed something that's more comprehensive, because most of those models are actually looking at enterprise level AI maturity. Now, when we're working with various units, teams, say, in a lot of the work that I do for competitive intelligence and foresight, that doesn't necessarily apply very well, because you've got strategic and innovation level that really does rely on enterprise-wide resources and initiatives. And so we've adapted this model. So what you're seeing here is that you've gotten different levels of maturity along the green here. Level 1 is initial, where you're just starting out, pretty ad hoc. Level 2, you've got AI is pretty active, but it's very much in experimentation mode. Nothing is really formalized yet. Level 3 is operational AI, where you're really using it to help you, enhance your operations. And level 4 is where you're using it now to support your strategic development. And then level 5 is really transforming your organization altogether. And so then what you see here are various maturity categories along the left. And this is very high level. So you've got categories relating to management and leadership, organizational factors that support AI maturity, technological factors, which is really what we tend to think about. And a lot of maturity models tend to really lean into this, is the technology and data and sources. And data is our lifeblood, especially for AI, because certainly without that, you just have an empty shell. So, and then you've got various resources that support that. Applications and performance is about how you're applying your AI applications, and then ethics and responsible use is just various types of considerations around fairness and bias and transparency, explainability, and legal ramifications regarding intellectual property and so forth. So all of this relies on a whole definitions and rubric that we're not going to go into, and we'll probably go into some of this in a future webinar. But there is a qualitative and quantitative aspect to this too. So we're looking at this through some metrics, but also just qualitative assessments. But this is very much about planning and growth. It's a snapshot here, but you can use this iteratively to understand how you're evolving, and in competitive intelligence purposes too. You can look at this, you can train this on your competitors. So now we're delving into the data and sources section of this, and you can see where it does get granular into these various dimensions. And I won't go into it right now because this isn't what this particular meeting is about. But I just want to show you that that the granularity is there, and it helps us understand where we are in terms of how we're leveraging AI and how we can adapt AI. Because when I mentioned that this can be used for growth, this can be used to help understand where you are and where you want to be. Because if your target is to achieve operational excellence, now this can help guide you in terms of understanding the facets that you need to address and that you can prioritize as well. And so it's important that that we understand the context of this, but applying an AI maturity model to your team that helps you understand where you are, so you can know where you're going. And you can begin to start setting targets and goals about where you want to train, and as well as developing various forms of AI or different use cases and capabilities. And then we've got competencies, and with this, now we're shifting from the organization to the team level to really team and practitioner level. And so with this, I've got a summary snapshot. Well, that's actually a sample snapshot of what Knowledge Informed has for published research competencies. We have it all blown out for the entire competitive intelligence process, and other functions as well. But this is just a tiny bit, and this is just a sample of each of these categories as well. This is not exhaustive, so please don't just take this and say, hey, these are the competencies for sourcing or the research aspects of published source collection, or OSINT. But what you're seeing here is we break out the competency categories within each of the intelligence functions. So this is the literature research function, right? So it was researching published sources online and print and various other formats. And we have the intelligence process competencies here and listed out for sourcing in some of these. And then we've got some of these listed for research, and we've got some of these also listed for content analysis. Now, that's where it used to be. So when I initially built this out, and we've had iterations over the years, because I initially started to build this when I began training, and so we used this when we were training participants for SLA's competitive in decision intelligence certificates program. And so this really was the basis for developing those courses. And so these competencies get pretty granular, and you'll have competencies for your own discipline for those of you who are not in competitive intelligence. So just replace it here. And it is probably you've already developed that, or your HR may have as well for key functions, because I've worked with various organizations in developing their competencies, and HR is very much involved in this. So if you haven't seen them, just ask around, because some HR folks may have them, or they can access some of these are already out there in open source for your particular application. But this is one that we've developed for our purposes, so it can be really exhaustive. And so here for sourcing, well, all of this was pretty good until AI hit, and so now we've developed an entire column just for that, and you can see how different it is. Where we're focusing on working knowledge of common sources, of industry resources, of macro environmental sources, traditional evaluation criteria, and the ability to apply intelligent source map for research. Right now, it's under an AI competencies. This isn't by the way a one-to-one comparison. So AI completely shifts its focus. Understand how to use Gen AI tools and how they operate. Working knowledge of Gen AI tools used for intelligence research, assessing the applicability of those tools, limitations of those tools, how to avoid IP risks. And by the way, we do have also IP here in sourcing just later in the list, because that is a one-to-one there. Then for research, we've got understanding prompt engineering concepts and practices, right? Whereas before is effective search strategies. Applying prompt engineering to target effective results and minimize false outputs from the key generative AI models. Applying specialized features like plugins and APIs for specialized research applications. Ability to apply integrations to create efficiencies. Under content, we've got ability to verify Gen AI outputs and errors in lack of precision, and then the availability to evaluate output for biases. So these are specific to AI. Now there are counterparts to evaluating published sources as well, but you can see how there is a technical aspect to this. And so it's really important that you start thinking about the competencies aspect for your own organization. You don't have to be exhaustive right now because we're early days. But if you're looking to build out your AI capabilities for your own team, you need to start thinking about this. And by the way, this is also iterative. You don't have to be exhaustive. Start with the basics, and you can blow that out. So don't feel as if this really needs to be ready for prime time. Just get started. But this is how you might harness competencies so that you can add the AI component to the Intel process. And I have individual qualities, which I won't go into, of course. But now I want to look a little bit more closely at skills. And this is where we take the competencies, and now I'm focusing in on the sourcing and the research piece. And now you can see here that we can overlay some of the actionable aspects that we can take regarding AI. And so some of these here at the top of the list relate to AI literacy. Then you can see that as we go down here, it builds into AI literacy plus whatever domain or process discipline that you've got. So replace that with what's of importance to you in what's applicable to you. And in this case, we're just using competitive intelligence as the placeholder, right? Then you've got AI literacy plus competitive intelligence, and also LIS, library and information science research functions, because that, those capabilities come into play too, because there are whole sets of tools that we can use to help us assess some of this as well, especially when we're looking at evaluating these tools. And then you can see for research, it's instead of AI literacy now, it's AI skills. And then it's skills plus CI and skills. So the sourcing really is the aboutness. And then when we get into the actual applied research aspects, it's more skills based. Now I've simplified this because there are skills that applied to sourcing as well that that's relevant. But I just want to underscore that aspect because I think that that is important as we continue to build. And so with this takes us to now, we understand the landscape, we understand how it applies to the landscape elements apply to our own internal processes and workflows. And then we look at the various competencies associated with that and some of the specific skills. Now we can start to plan. And with that, your roadmaps are very handy. And I've just broken this out just very roughly. Please don't follow this to the letter. This is really about what suits your own organization. And so you'll need to evaluate that. But this is just a generic one to lay out how this might work. So year one, I've broken this down into quarters, where in the first quarter, you might just decide that for you and your team, you want to focus on understanding the landscape as it applies to your own domain. And then you want to add AI literacy as it relates to that as well. So be focused. And then Q2, you want to build on that. And now you can take, AI, plus the process aspect. And so that's what you saw in the chart where we overlaid, the intelligence process with the various forms of generative, generative AI and AI tools. And it's you take that and you build that out, and then you can start applying AI skills, because once you've achieved some aspects of landscape awareness and literacy, you know which skills to target. So you're not just chasing whatever somebody is kind of throwing at you, saying, oh, try this tool or try that tool, and whatever shiny object is coming your way. And then Q3, you're focusing more on competencies, because you've laid the groundwork in Q1 and Q2 and understanding where you are. And so you can start to build out some of the competencies, and you continue to build your skills. And then Q4, with the strength of the competencies under you, you can start to really focus in on the types of skills you want to build. In year two, you want to conduct a landscape review, because it updates. And sometimes I think in some more dynamic areas, you want to just do this iteratively anyway. But in Q1, you're doing it really just out of due diligence, like we did in January. We looked back on 2023 to see where we were. We looked forward at 2024 to see what we need to prepare for. So that's the type of exercise you want to do. Combine that with a competencies review, because the competencies are based on where that environment's going. The AI competencies column that you saw in the competencies chart, that really didn't exist in that form this time last year. And so with everything moving so quickly in this space, we need to think about that. And then you put together your plan for the year, develop your skills, do a mid-year review, more skill building and more skill building in Q4. And then in year three, it's pretty much the same idea. And now as we go, there may be new tools and so forth, but you can see that this gives you the framework for your team to be able to identify and understand where you are, identify what your goals and targets are, and then you can begin to more systematically move through that. But it's important to be flexible too, because in best laid plans and all, there could be some innovations or disruptions that come along that's going to change how you approach your competencies and skill building, because hey, 2022, we weren't expecting this. So I just outlined a few things to think about when you're skills building. And so here we've got AI literacy on one side and applied AI skills on the other side. And you do want to approach them somewhat differently and not put one before the other. And so it's important. Now, it's not to say, though, some of you are already learning prompt engineering, and that's okay, even as you are beefing up on your AI literacy. But what I'm saying is that before you really get deep into the skills building, understand the landscape first so you can decide where you want to target the skills building. And there are a number of different online courses and tutorials. Some of you have already started, and I've seen in LinkedIn posts, some folks have, finished, this or that. And I really think it's terrific that people are already diving into this aspect. And there are some terrific AI literacy tools that are being offered by service providers. And they've been doing it for some time. Google's been an early entrant in this because they've been doing this for AI for quite some time. And then IBM had launched something this past year. Amazon Web Services also this past year. So there are new folks coming on, and the quality is really fabulous. And so I do encourage you, just pick one, or you can just kind of shop around and kind of, just kind of dabble a little bit. But there are also academic courses if you really want to get into it, and Coursera, edX, and there's plenty others, Udemy, and so forth that offer these courses on a more structured, and extensive basis. In some cases, you can get certificates. I know Google offers them, and certainly Coursera and edX do too. YouTube channels, believe it or not, there are just some really great tutorials and experts who are there offering those tools as well. So there's really not a lack of resources. If anything, it's about where to land. And then there's also a lot of noise. There are a lot of folks there's a gold rush of people who are trying to create courses, and some of them are not necessarily of the best quality, but at the literacy level, these are mostly safe bets. It's just a matter of how extensive they will be. And then just, of course, teaching style. And then you've got applied AI skills, and the same thing, very similar players that are offering some of the more technical aspects of AI. And this is not the aboutness of AI as an AI literacy, but how do you roll up your sleeves and start to leverage some of these tools using no code, low code, to be able to build, some AI tools for some very specific functionalities in your team. Say if your, organization, doesn't have the resources to be able to, devote to your specific AI needs. Well, that's perhaps a path. And so, so there are ways that you can learn that. You can certainly also learn AI more systematically as well. And of course, go really deep into it. But what we're really talking about more just, overlaying some applied AI skills on top of what we're doing, not becoming, AI practitioners and developers at this point. Also importantly here, prompt engineering communities, and some of you are probably familiar with these, but these are the two that I would recommend that you check out first, because there are a lot. But some of these also offer free prompt engineering training, and this particular area is moving so rapidly, simply because the models change. And so sometimes you have, some prompts that work really great. You've created beautiful templates that have been working, and then one day it doesn't work as well. So staying on top of the community and these skills will alert you to some of these changes and how to adapt. And then the facets of prompt engineering for the facets of AI is vast. It's not just about large language models, the ones that tend to be headline makers. So dive into this. And then there are also emerging CI AI specialists, those of us who really understand both, and are doing just this. Helping folks understand where we are and how to apply AI to what we do. And so that's the skills building portion, as well as how to prepare. So now let's move on to how do we maintain clarity. Now we've learned to organize, and we've also seen some tools that can help us gain some clarity about where we are in terms of the landscape, in terms of how it fits with our own practices on and our own domains on a broader level. But we also need to have some clarity in terms of the AI planning and decisions and activities. And so I want to take a step back here and just to underscore that situational awareness is extremely important. We started with situational awareness as our first slide. So if we just take section 1 and plug that in, now, this is where we're at. But the next step is we need to build on that and apply foresight, because if you are focusing just on where AI is today, as it's publicly known and applied, you're already behind. Because so much is happening now in terms of the development world. So paying attention to what the various service providers and platforms and tools are saying in terms of how the direction in which they're going is very important. So we know that Google Gemini is rolling out, or has rolled out on a limited basis, but we know that Gemini Ultra isn't at its full rollout yet. And so but we do know some of the features. We've had a sneak peek, a controversial sneak peek, if you're familiar with some of those videos, but a sneak peek of where this is headed. And so now that should inspire, prompt, and push us to start thinking about how do we organize and to structure our learning towards what the various players are already saying they're going, right? These are technologies that they're moving towards. So the foresight piece is very important to help us understand how we can skill build in a more proactive and not reactive basis. And this is very important because I think as many of us are in situations where we're wondering, boy, in 5 years' time, are we going to be in this role? And or will my department even exist? Or my team? It's important for us to begin to help be the eyes and ears of our organizations and add value in this way. Knowledge work can expand into the areas of helping our own organizations make sense of AI, to be more proactive about it. And so it's not just about servicing folks, and answering their questions, or just traditional ways that we've been pursuing various types of knowledge and insights work, but to think about how we can help our organizations make proactive decisions through the foresight aspect, through how we understand the AI space using the various tools that we just discussed. So then there are two tracks. When we are then moving to the next steps, we're looking at AI from the standpoint of the research topic. So those of us are in positions where we're looking at AI to try to understand what AI is, to be able to help support the organization in its own, planning and deployment of AI, or in competitive intelligence to understand where where AI is headed, so that they can use that as a competitive advantage, and the various other applications as well. So AI as a research topic, and then there's also AI as the tool for support. And so as a tool and support, this is where we've just been in the first phase of our discussion, where we're looking at AI and trying to understand how we can apply AI to what we do, as opposed to how do we understand AI to be able to help the organization planning, decision, and strategy support, which is this. Okay, so that's the difference between these two. And it's important to segment this so that we're not conflating one for the other, because it's very easy with all the moving parts, but organize these in two tracks. Why are you looking at AI? What is your AI focus? In some cases, you'll only be focused on one. In other cases, you'll be focused on both, actually, because you might be charged with having to understand the AI landscape, in terms of the competition, and that directly supports various other functions in the organization, including organizational strategy. For some of you, it's just looking at this really more tactically and operationally. How do we build out, leverage AI? So for research support, use the AI research frameworks. And so the various types of AI research, maturity model is one of them that you can use, but there are also a number of other models that you can use, that assess AI, and that also assesses AI with the various industry environment, macro environment. So those are some tools we're already accustomed to using. And by the way, if you're not familiar with some of these references that I'm making, I'm happy to do a deeper dive. I just don't want to repeat too much for the other sessions that we've already conducted. And so then there are outcomes to that. Then for tool support, you are looking at various types of AI tools and planning frameworks, like some of the ones that we just used. And then from there, you have your outcomes, and then you can plan. And that's where we arrived at the roadmap in the previous section. But for the clarity, this is the organizing model that I like to use systematically, and then with the specific tools in it. But importantly now, you have to loop back. You have to be iterative because things are moving so quickly in AI that you need to be sure that you maintain the situational awareness. It's not just about taking a snapshot and now you've got your 3-year plan. And so iteration is very important. And then clarity, well, we're struggling with hypes versus signals. And I've been doing a lot of presentations, on that foresight and early warning, in particular for AI. And so this is where I'm not going to go into that. Some of you already heard me speak, publicly, even privately on that in some of your own organizations. And again, I'm always happy to clarify. So just get in touch with me if there's something you're not following. And we will do more sessions, webinars, just exploring many of these facets, because today we're just helping you understand the picture, the bigger picture. So the analytical frameworks, these are the ones we know and love. We've been using, these frameworks in business and industry, the various types of, technical frameworks, industry frameworks, Porter's 5 forces model, macro environmental frameworks, steep pestle analysis, and I also like to use, issue analysis is actually one of my favorites as well. So then there are foresight tools and techniques like monitoring, activities. Then you move into looking at, different foresight models. And some of these are here. So this is, some linchpin analysis that I like to use for foresight, backcasting. I also like to use inflection point analysis to understand where we are. So you can see here, that the hype phase is right there. And then you can see, here, this is the futures wheel that we use to understand, here's where we are at this point, and where various types of developments may occur at the first level development, and then where that might spin into and what the possible paths may be. So there are a whole host of other tools, but these tools help us understand, sort out the various types of signals that are out there. And not only do they help us sort it out, but they help us understand the context and the flow. As you can see here, that in these cycles here, that a particular movement like AI, it was in the latent stage from the 1960s to 2023, and then generative AI hit, and now we're kind of in a hype cycle, and then we're moving along, through corrections and so forth. And so for those of you who have lived through the dot-com boom, this is a fun exercise to do, because we've already reached the full end of the cycle. So do that as a parlor game, and with your team. But each of these and these other models help us sort out the signals. The first thing you got to do, and then you can start to understand and to suss out what is hype, what could be hype, and what is absolutely not hype. And so we don't have time to dive into all of the various facets, but just to highlight this. So now we've got Gartner's emerging technology life cycle. Many of us are familiar with this, and I've heard a lot of folks say, well, Gartner says that generative AI is the peak of the hype cycle, so I'm really just not going to pay much attention to it. And to that, I say, we need to get granular. If we look at generative AI, there are many facets to generative AI, as you can see from the landscape models that we've looked at. And so with the various facets of generative AI, you've got perhaps one track that one facet follows, you've got another track that another facet will follow, and yet another. So to lean into this model, very simplistic model for generative AI, is a huge mistake, because you need to look at the various aspects of generative AI and where that's headed. And if you look at this, none of them really, in my book, reaches a deep trough, because generative AI is probably going to be more like mobile phones, where it just kind of, once it started to take off, it starts to take off, because it's transformational. If something is so transformational, it doesn't necessarily hit that disillusionment. And so it's really important that we don't take some of these models wholesale, because because our biases might allow us to create some blind spots by leaning too much into these models. So it really is about still applying critical thinking. Think about the context, various types of developments, dynamics that are happening in these spaces, the value and the impact that they're offering, and not just now, but forecast in the future. And we'll see that it's not that simple. Not each of these are tracking like this. And so please don't use these models simplistically when we're looking at assessing out hype. So to manage signals, hype, and to gain clarity, it's so important for us to just be updated and to gain perspective. So I love the conferences, right? So, the Consumers Electronics Conference that just happened, that happens annually, a lot of hype, but at least it gives us some sense of where things might be headed. And then there are many, many forms of AI conferences that are popping up all over the place now. And it seems like, some of these are building themselves as like, the world conference. And so world conferences are happening, everywhere. And then there are industry conferences, then they're all paying attention to AI. The only thing is that I see that so many conferences are jumping on the bandwagon, and they're not necessarily bringing on speakers who understand AI very well. They might be in the industry players. And so I just want to just to caution you to scrutinize it for that. And to ensure that you're looking at the folks, paying attention to folks who really do understand the intersections and what they're talking about. Then there are the various announcement days, the development days that are happening, that the various major vendors put out there. Again, a lot of hype, but it also gives you a sense of how things are rolling out, because this is where they roll out various types of new tools. And then you have various types of media talking about those, and that's when you can start to suss out the signals from the noise. And then various research papers that are put out there by these very organizations. And then some of these are also, a lot of papers are also published on archive. So they're not quite peer reviewed, but they do give you a sense of where things might be headed. That is drinking from the fire hose, so I don't expect you to lean in, but there are some favorite sort of YouTube, I hate to say influencers because I think it cheapens what they do, but they actually follow these research papers. 2-minute papers is one, and they literally follow the research. And so I'll just watch the video, so I don't need to go into archive and and follow 600 papers, 600 to 800 papers that were published last year on AI. So find ways of being efficient. Tech media does that as well. Communities, Y Combinator's Hacker News, folks will just there's chatter there that helps you. Reddit has a number of different channels as well to focus on, and then there are certainly others. And then thought leaders, I mentioned some thought leaders here that are pretty grounded. They're not hypesters, Andrew you've got Gary Marcus especially. I actually follow him. He's got a Substack channel, and I follow him because he kind of pushes back on almost everything, and that's healthy to be able to see what his perspective is. And he's out of NYU, he's a professor out of there. So there are different things to there are different ways and individuals to leverage to be able to help you organize all of this and make more sense out of this. And to think about, as you look at this this list, what's driving these hypesters. What's behind it? Are they trying to sell something? Are they drinking the Kool-Aid? Are some of them also supporting their friends? It's the other thing that we sometimes see, especially in the tech space. And so we want to be sure that we're really looking at, things that are balanced. And then what are the informed skeptics are saying? And so, so we've got Hinton, for example, who's a godfather of AI, right? He is, one of those who, can also help to correct what we're seeing, or, to warn. How will stakeholders perceive all of this? Because that through those lenses we gain perspective on what's valuable, what's not valuable, what we should be concerned about, what barriers might exist, despite the hype. So when we're looking at what's being hyped, start thinking about what the barriers are to implementation or adoption and implementation, because that inherently, even if you don't follow any of these thought leaders, if you start thinking about why it won't work or why it might work more slowly than what some of these cheerleaders are saying, that helps you as well. And then you want to also correct, because you want to make sure you don't overcorrect, bias being what it is, right? And then looking at blind spots. What are people not asking? What's missing? What should people be looking at? What questions should we be asking that they're not asking, and that we should ask as well? So now, how do we prepare? So at the organizational team levels, as well as for ourselves individually. And so this is pretty simple, right? We do diligence. Some of the tools that we just learned today, especially in section 1, apply. right? That's doing our homework. So this is basically the first set of bullets right here. And then the other thing is really key, team learning. There's so much out there that if you are a part of a team, segment this out and then have the teams bring this back, to the hive and share. Sharing also not only helps to elevate what you know collectively, but sharing now also surfaces new capabilities that inoculates you from obsolescence. And that allowing people to understand what you know. Tap the various hubs that are out there. If you create a hub around your team, then inherently you're building that, so that supports the team learning. But I tap external hubs. So when I talk about tapping these thought leaders, that's really what I'm doing. I don't have the time or the bandwidth to be able to lean in and investigate all the various facets that I need to keep on top of. So in some cases, I will do a deep dive. In other cases, I'm relying on others to be my eyes and ears. And so you need to do that as well. Avoid also chasing the trends, because there's just a lot of shiny stuff out there. Everyone's saying the next great tool, but be grounded in your organizational strategy and plan, rather than just chasing AI. And there's a lot of that happening. And then understanding our domain impacts, what we're doing. And this is the series of First Fridays is where we're trying to understand how will AI affect knowledge and insights work. And so we'll continue to do this, and we'll continue to do our homework through these channels. And then planning and deployment, right? Applying best practices. But if it's early days, there's not going to be a whole lot of them. So you're going to have to innovate. Like I said, some of these tools that I showed you at the beginning are tools that we've been using really for the better part of 15 years, like in training, the competencies. But we've also had to innovate. And we're all called on to do that. And now I understand that that's a big ask when people are feeling a bit uncertain and feeling that somehow this is, you don't know enough, right, to be able to innovate. But if you do this collectively, it does help. And so, trying to understand how you can build your capabilities and just looking at opportunities and risks and, and then setting your goals and so forth. But innovating in terms of even things like your internal guidelines, right? You're creating something that's new, start small. And then communicating all that, informing folks what you're doing, informing folks some tools, practices that you've learned that they can use as well. And then keep soliciting questions, concerns, and inputs, because especially on the team and organizational level, because it's really important that we talk about this, because people are fearful. They're sometimes ambivalent, even resistant to AI, and so it's important that we surface all this. But we need to understand what's here and what's near. So situational awareness, and then what's coming up, and then what's next beyond that, so that we can inform our planning, especially where we're working out 3 to 3 years. And then what will disappear. I've talked about this in other sessions where we looked at the, some things that will be breaking down, silos, and also some tasks and functions. And so that also helps us understand too how it fits into all of this. So that we know then how to fill some of those gaps. And I'm just going to leave you with a few things. These are some of my favorites. Again, this is sort of a bandwidth issue, right? A lot of us just don't have time to be chasing, all the new developments in AI. So at the very least, if you don't have time, key in on the annual AI reports. And here are some of these. There's certainly more. Forrester puts out one, and et cetera. But these are the ones that, that I think you should take a look at, because they provide a good overview and help you with the landscape as well. Focus on these, and that at least, on an annual basis, or on a rolling basis, actually, because these are put out at different parts of the year. And so different times of the year. So just focusing on these reports will allow you to be able to get the state of AI as it evolves and over the year and through the year. And then there are just some signal sources. There's just certainly a lot more, but I just extracted a few of these. If you really want to get into it, the information, this gives you a lot of signals on an ongoing basis. It's a powerhouse. But I also, like AI Explained. So when I mentioned some of the thought leaders that I like to follow who look at research papers, That is one of them. He does it, so we don't have to. Well, we do, but it's still not, not as extensively as he. So with this, we'll open it up for questions, but I do want to mention that there are some upcoming topics as well that we'll be covering, and then whatever other questions you have. We'll be covering this in our first Friday webinars, like as we are here. There are also Substack articles that I'll be publishing as well. And then if you have any questions and we can add to those topics, by all means. So this is where you can access some of these resources. And with that, contact me if you have any questions. And so we'll stop here and we'll take some questions as well. So all right. So I see that there have been some questions in the chat that have come in. There are also some other questions too that folks have shared with me before this session. So in terms of the actual, let's see. So I see here, John has asked questions. What about skills? Where do they fit in this model?
You answered that. You answered that later.
Okay.
So I could have erased that, but yeah, no, thank you. I
no
spoke too
worries.
soon.
Okay, fabulous. No, I love it. I love that you were already there, right? Thinking about the important questions. And then thinking, another question too is, are there shortcuts to training and prompt engineering that you recommend? Well, here's the thing. There are principles that you can learn. I don't recommend shortcuts in prompt engineering because it's become a discipline. And when you go to those two sites that I recommend, and the links will be in the handouts. So when you get the handouts to that, you can just click on that and explore. You will see that all the various facets. And so there are principles to that, but I don't recommend that we take huge shortcuts in prompt engineering, because that's where we start to get into the weeds and the false sense of security, and there are some sort of vagaries. So that's something. Principles, yes, but actual discipline of prompt engineering, no. And then I have a question here from one of our colleagues where this person said, I'm on a CI team in which we're not even particularly good at the basic stuff, right? That we actually lack some competencies and even some of the fundamentals. So how do we even add the AI layer to it? And this is where I think it's important. AI is an opportunity. And so when we're dealing with AI in this case, the question of we're lacking some fundamental competencies, the AI piece can enable us to begin to have conversations about those foundational aspects, to say, well, where else are we also missing? And so as you embark on a team learning or even team transformation, that can be then built into it. So I think that that's one part of it. But I do want to recognize too an important aspect of that question, which is a lot of folks are jumping into AI. And this is regarding CI practices. So forgive me, those of you who are not in competitive intelligence, but this could apply to you too. A lot of folks who are jumping into AI and not quite understanding a lot of basic and fundamental practices, they kind of skipped over it. And the advent of AI is giving people a false sense of security. Hey, I can research this and it's enabling me to do this. I can, I don't need to, do all this due diligence in terms of learning. And that is a mistake. That's something that I do see. In fact, I saw a webinar, a couple of webinars this past year in which there were sessions presenting on AI and competitive intelligence, and they were featuring these fun, fantastic AI tools. Except you could tell that the presenters really didn't have a good grounding of CI. And so we're going to see more of that. Be prepared that we're going to see more of that across disciplines, not just in competitive intelligence, but in others, research, knowledge disciplines, because this Dunning-Kruger effect, as enabled by AI. AI is going to make us feel that we understand and we're more capable of certain practices. And it's just satisficing that I wrote an article recently about that for the Substack channel, but it's satisficing is a thing. And I'll be talking about satisficing a lot more, because that has to do a lot with how we plan and the shortcuts that we take, that good enough And we're talking about something that's vast, we're going to miss something if we don't follow good principles. The other, and if I haven't really sufficiently answered that question to the poster, please feel free to post in the chat, and I am happy, I'm happy to add, to this. And then we've got time. People are asking, I don't have time to add to all of this. I don't know what to, I don't know how to get through all of this stuff. My job is already busy enough, and boy, don't we understand this. And this is where I will keep leaning in. This is not an individual effort. You cannot do this on your own. You need to lean in as a team. And so as a team, I feel that it's important for us to harness what we've learned and share it. So we're doing it in a forum like this, but you do that internally as well. We need to break it down into parts, so that we're not all just drinking from a fire hose and inevitably missing very key components of this. So I just want to address that aspect of it. And there are other techniques too that I'm happy to speak to once I understand your situation. So you can just ping me and say, hey, this is my situation. What can I do? Where should I look? And I'm happy to also point you in the right direction. So with that, are there any other questions that folks have? I'm not seeing it in the meeting chat. Okay, so I think we'll end there. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. I hope we'll see you in our March session as well. And also stay tuned. As usual, I will be sending out, to those of you who registered, the handouts. So all those links that I sent you don't have to worry about all that. I will get the handouts out sooner this time as well. And so you don't have to wait. And then stay tuned to the reporting. I will be posting this also. So you'll see that in my next communication to you. But thank you all so much for joining us. Once again, thank you for your questions. And I look forward to exploring more of these dimensions, of this intersection of AI and knowledge insights work with you. Please don't hesitate to share with me your questions and the things you want to learn about, because then I can start to share some of these with you. Because as we work with different companies and teams, I can start to, bring in some of what we're learning and what we're applying to them as well, because we're helping these folks, also harness some of these tools, and we can also adapt along the way. So thank you very much.